Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Pronago, and joining me as always is IskatuMesk. Welcome to the Big Boys Table, episode 16, where we're going to talk about what made Brood War the best RTS ever made, and why that's important.
I think we might also end up talking about that guy.
What guy?
That guy.
Oh, that guy.
That guy.
Well, the guy that Mesk is referring to is Designer Dave, I assume.
He's quite the designer. He made some non-functional triggers and doesn't remember anything about the game he allegedly did janitor duty for.
Well, that was for Warcraft 3 anyways, so not super relevant, but I guess it is in the grand scheme of things because we're going to be comparing Brood War to a lot of other games that came after it, especially games that came after it, because I'm not super familiar with the games that came before. I don't know if you are. Like the Dune 2...
Not nearly on the level I am Brood War, so
right.
Only distantly.
Okay, so the reason why I wanted to make this episode's topic about what made Brood War so good and like why it's such an engaging and rewarding experience to play if you're willing to put in the effort to actually learn the mechanics and all that other stuff is because eventually I aspire to make my own game, and it is going to be an RTS if I have my way. So naturally I'm going to try and learn from the best in my eyes, which would be Brood War. So I sort of wanted to come at this from a multitude of different angles, but I think the first time we talk about this, which would be in this podcast, we can reference some of the other games and try and like backport our observations into Brood War, like basically what made those games fall apart under the context of being an RTS. And we could talk about anything like single player, multiplayer, whatever the case may be, but functionally I think we'll probably just be talking a lot about the mechanics, which will be more or less consistent across all modes of game. So is there anything in particular you want to start with for the other games, or should we just start with like a breakdown of what an RTS actually is and should be? And how that pertains?
I think that there's a few things that should be brought to the forefront first, which is one of the reasons why Brood War was so popular and so successful. So, I unfortunately don't remember a lot of details now because it was a while since I remembered it, but I know Korea back in 1999, 2000, wherever, they were in like a depression or whatever. Like their economy wasn't doing too well. And I'm not entirely sure. There was a way this was relevant to Brood War because it has to do with how the framework for a professional Brood War play was set up. Certainly Brood War today would not be nearly as big as it was, and Blizzard wouldn't have worked as hard to kill it as they did if it wasn't for the organization known as KESPA. A lot of people had a lot of gripes with KESPA's policies and other such things, but like them or hate them, KESPA is absolutely integral to Brood War's success. Absolutely massive. So Brood War in itself is a fluke. There's tons of problems with it all over the place. It's far from a perfect game, but it is, and as far as the RTS is concerned, as perfect as you will ever see. It is a fluke, and by extent of that, it is perfect. You'll never, ever, ever see a game even remotely approach the shadow of what Brood War was. The closest and best and last chance the industry had was Armies of Exego, and I think that will be a good discussion point later down the line to compare some of the additions and changes and stuff Armies of Exego did, since it was very, very specifically intended to be StarCraft 2. That's precisely what the developers wanted to do with it, was to create the next StarCraft, but evidently they fell short. But when you look at StarCraft as a platform, you think about KESPA, because KESPA is intrinsic to it. And Brood War was televised. It was a TV show on the scale of, football. It was national. It was massive. It was huge. It basically was like the equivalent of football for Korea. It was huge. And many massive organizations were involved in it before Blizzard started tearing it apart with StarCraft 2 and their interjection. They only started getting involved when StarCraft 2 came out because they knew StarCraft 2 could not compete with Brood War. So they did all they could to destroy Brood War. And later down the line, when China and other individuals proved that Brood War still refused to die, Blizzard decided to try to monetize it with Remastered instead, which was also an utter disaster. So when you think about Brood War, when you think about the balance, and you think about all this other stuff, Brood War is super unique. Super, super unique. And the reason why KESPA and the organizations and the competitive scene is so important is because they're the ones that decided how the game grew. It is very, 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 very easy to say that without KESPA and the equivalent organizations and Korea as a body supporting Brood War would not become nearly as renowned or as significant as it was today. Because Blizzard effectively abandoned Brood War after it was released. They made a very, very few handful of patches. The game was very, very static. And this is in stark contrast to the vast majority of games that come afterwards, where they've taken on the so-called agile approach, constantly changing literally everything they can, because the developers feel that the game isn't being played precisely the way they want to play it, which is usually a very low skill level. You can see it with StarCraft 2, you can see that with Dawn of War, you can see it with all the various iterations of trying to make the RTS not an RTS. Things like heroes and stuff like that being introduced into the multiplayer spectrum. Things like squadrons, things like automation, pretty much everything that Supreme Commander had did minus the economics. Just train wrecks all around, attempting to become the next Brood War, the next sensation, especially in terms of competitive play. You'll see lots of advertisements for esports, but really failing to understand some of the really major reasons why Brood War was very, very successful and remains successful. And the static nature of it is extremely important. So when we start talking about stuff like mechanics and stuff, these are the things that tend to be very, very volatile in other titles, that tend to get changed up quite a bit. For example, in StarCraft 2, it's like not even a month goes by without Blizzard deciding they want to just basically change everything. The frigging Infestor has just been, and the Raven have just been torn apart left and right. Whereas in Brood War, the comparatively massive changes with stuff like the cost increase on the spawning pool and stuff like that. So these are definitely things that you want to bring to the forefront when bringing up Brood War, because Brood War is intrinsic to the scene that gave it life. The scene was Brood War, and Brood War was the scene. And Blizzard's non-interaction is what allowed that to exist. And it's also inversely the same reason why StarCraft 2 will never ever become a competitively recognized game by an equally large organization. Blizzard attempts to compensate for this by injecting tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of money into it. But as a game, StarCraft 2 is an absolute failure. And when you look at the other genres like League of Legends and Dota 2 and stuff like that have all kind of forked off, because StarCraft is the progenitor of all of these. It is the original progenitor, because it spawned Warcraft 3, and Warcraft 3 tried to be the next StarCraft while not being StarCraft. That created the void, the gap that people wanted to have something new that weren't like super invested into StarCraft, and then that created the MOBA, which was super low skill, and then anybody could get into it, and anybody could be competitive, and anybody could make money off of streaming, and so on and so forth. All these interactions are all super related to Brood War, and especially like an image of Brood War. So the other thing I would like to talk about before we really get into the nitty-gritty of it is the misconception that Brood War is a clickfest. Because believe it or not, but there is actually communities of people out there who believe that you can't play Brood War without having 300 APM. Because they watched some YouTube video about some Korean showing his APM spam at the very beginning of the game. Now, it is true that high-level players can have extremely high peak APM of around like 800 plus. However, when you really think about it, a lot of this is not effective APM. This is actually why Blizzard introduced effective APM into StarCraft 2, is because so many people got butthurt about having people with higher APM than them. So Blizzard basically introduced something that said, hey, this makes all of your APM low, so you too can feel included. Wow, isn't Blizzard really progressive? But I digress. The core of the theme is that you don't have to have 300 APM to be good at Brood War. So if you're one of those individuals, get that out of your head. You will be better off for it no matter which game you decide to play.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up the idea that a lot of other companies wanted to make the next Brood War, but they never ended up trying to replicate what Brood War actually did in terms of its gameplay and its quality of being an RTS. You know, you had Blizzard themselves make future RTS games. Well, obviously, Warcraft 3 had way too many RPG elements to be considered like a classic tried and true RTS, but even just in general, you look at something like StarCraft 2, the actual successor to the game, and it's like pales in comparison to the original. There's so many new mechanics. Yeah. There's so much that's missing from the original. And, you know, the actual only other game I think, you already brought it up, is Armies of Exego. That's the only other game I think that's been made that really tried to emulate Brood War's success through its gameplay, and not just because, hey, it wanted to fill the void of, we needed a Brood War killer in the marketing department or something, which is kind of puzzling to me. Like, I don't understand why people didn't just look to make a better game than Brood War, or attempt to, instead of trying to make a game that would like market to the people who enjoyed Brood War. But I guess the same sort of thing happens with like God of War succeeding Devil May Cry and stuff in the ARPG genre. So
it's actually really, really complicated. There is actually a lot of RTSs out there. It's just they're not very well known, and unfortunately I can't speak too much about them. But I have actually played a number of niche RTSs from around the era of Warcraft 3, and unfortunately I can't really remember even some of their names because this was an extremely long time ago. But even like Black and White and Black and White 2, these sort of like simulation-esque RTSs. And there was another one, Warlords something. There was a series
Warlords
of
Battlecrime? There's 3 of those that were an RTS.
Yeah, those were those. I have heard that they were decent, but I've never had the chance to play them. It's on my to-do list. But there was another one that had somewhat of a similar name that is extremely unknown, and I cannot for the life of me remember the name of it. But it was an awesome RTS, and they all kind of followed the same sort of thing. There's also Earth 2150, Earth 2140, and the hysterical Earth 2160. So there is actually quite a sum of RTSs around that point. It's kind of like when RTS was really at its high point. Brood War kind of like set that stage, but it was really 3D, the fad of 3D, which is still a fad today. Most people still don't understand how to do stuff with 3D properly, much less efficiently. And Warcraft 3 is definitely a very paramount example of that. But there was a lot of people who wanted to try. And there was another game, I cannot quite remember. There's a lot of these like niche RTSs I've at least played a little bit of, but their names, because it was like 10 plus years ago, I don't really remember. But there was an iconic 3D one back in the day. But you actually find that a lot of these come from Europe or around there, as a lot of these have non-Western originations, including Armies of Exego and Spellforce. So I've also played Spellforce and a little bit of Spellforce too. I have not played the newer one. They're all my two. Actually, I attempted to LP Spellforce, and I can discuss that later when we get into like the RPG stuff, because that's a very long-winded one. But I'm just remembering that, and it was utterly disgusting. There's many reasons why those games ultimately failed, and it's one of the reasons like why StarCraft 2 failed is you've got two polarities when people try to copy something. First of all, they're scared of being seen as just a carbon copy, which is what StarCraft 2 should have been. That would have been definitely the very safe way to play it, as just a carbon copy, add some new units, and, you know, still use 2D, of course. So you could use 2.5D if you really wanted to, like Age of Wonders 2, but that's really as far as you should have gone. And just be StarCraft 2, not, you know, a cargo cult of StarCraft, which is what it is. So cargo cult, there's actually an origination for this terminology. I think it may have been Hawaiian Islands, or it was some other islands. And during World War II, planes would fly overhead. And I think they sometimes had landing strips in there too, like bases and stuff. And you had tribes in there of people who had no idea what that was. They had never been really exposed to technology before. But the planes, I guess that like the soldiers and stuff would exchange food or whatever. There's a documentation on it that I saw a while ago. And these people would come to see the planes as gods. So this is where the term cargo cult comes from. They'd make like makeshift like shrines, runways, thinking it would bring the planes to them, bring the food to them, bring the blessings to them. Cargo cult. They worship something and make things from it without actually really understanding what it is. That is what stuff like Diablo 3 and StarCraft 2 and most of these other like pseudo RTSs are. These people who want to make something, but they either don't understand what it is they're copying off of, or in what's more likely the case is they actually really don't want to. So let's take, for example, let's go to another genre for a moment. Any of you who's familiar with the MMO market will know about World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV. So Final Fantasy XIV, its first version when it came out, it wasn't Square's first MMO. But at the time, World of Warcraft is the dominant beast. So you have a million games coming out that everybody thinks is going to be the next WoW killer. They're finally going to give Blizzard competition. They don't understand what makes World of Warcraft popular. And it's not because it's a game. It's because of Blizzard's logo. It's because of the market that they've attracted. They've got a very, very solid, safe market. A very safe space. When Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 comes out, it is a beautiful looking game. Looks very good. Very high quality assets everywhere. And its netcode was the worst of any MMO in existence. Even when you're playing straight from Korea's servers. It was atrocious. There was a lot of dumb grind and other like just very archaic, untested shit in it. And Square Enix did something really bizarre. They actually pulled the game. And they said, wow, we made a mistake, we want to improve. It kind of is reminiscent of back when StarCraft was first being developed. Blizzard got criticism that looked too much like Warcraft, because it was literally just Warcraft in space.
Yeah, it was the same engine.
Yeah. So Blizzard was like, wow, let's improve. Like, as opposed to today where they would rather troll you, like with the frigging cow level happy place in Diablo 3, that's literally that, like, just a fuck you to anybody who's played Diablo. That's literally what it is.
Well, yeah, it's just like, oh, you thought this game wasn't dark and gritty enough because we fucked with the lighting too much or whatever, because our art direction isn't really art direction. So here, have this meme.
Yep. So that's literally what they do now instead of actually give in to any kind of criticism whatsoever. They don't take feedback. They have hired CMs and stuff to basically pat people's back. That's all that's ever been on like Mapsters IRC is just, yeah, we listen to what you do. They don't. They never have. Not since that day where they actually decide to improve StarCraft. And that's why StarCraft is a fluke. So Square Enix did this with Final Fantasy XIV. And then sometime later, out came 2.0. So the first thing you note about 2.0 is that it looks like Square basically copied World of Warcraft. Because that's basically what the MMO formula is. You copy World of Warcraft. But this is the thing. This is the thing. At this stage, World of Warcraft has been out for like around 10 years or so. And it's not a young game, which means that Blizzard has improved some things in it, but very predominantly add-on makers have improved a lot of things in it, especially in terms of like the user interface and the user experience and stuff like that. Square goes through all this effort, all this money, changing their staff, whatever, to make Final Fantasy XIV 2.0. Very, very obviously looking to World of Warcraft of how to change the game. So the movement system, there was a lot of like ramp up and ramp down in like your movement speed and stuff. That all got axed. It controls a little bit more smoothly. I would say it's second only to World of Warcraft. But they didn't actually pay attention to World of Warcraft. They didn't actually look at the current state of the game, what the add-ons people were using did, how the user interface and stuff worked. The user interface in Final Fantasy XIV is the worst user interface for any game on the market that I have ever experienced. It is fundamentally fucked at the technical level. Like, the whole thing needs to be scrapped and redone by an entirely different team. It is an absolute disaster. You can't open this menu with that menu. You can't leave that menu with this menu. There's so many arbitrary constrictions and restrictions and nestled inline conditions that prevent you from doing fucking anything at all. And the game itself is still clunky as fuck. So you look at that and you think, this is a cargo cult, World of Warcraft. They wanted to make World of Warcraft, but they didn't want to put in the actual research to understand what made World of Warcraft actually really like playable. Honestly, just playable. Final Fantasy XIV still has like a multiple second delay in the world between when things should happen and when they do happen. There's indicators fucking everywhere, like in a mobile phone game. Those are desynced to fuck. Where you can be standing in them and move out, and the indicator ends, and then you get hit anyways. That shit's fucking everywhere. There's tons and tons and tons of problems like that. They've addressed some very minor issues throughout the years, but we're sitting at like the second expansion pack, and there's still no changes. And this is a behavior you see with pretty much every genre. Pretty much every genre. Shooters, for example. We don't need kill sequences and indicators and leveling up and stats in a fucking shooting game. But those get introduced into shooting games. Shooting games are about precision and skill and positioning and reflexes and knowing the map and knowing the weapons and knowing the interactions and knowing the behaviors. So now we've got this Borderlands cruft, this Mass Effect cruft, this garbage that puts in grinding and Diablo-esque shit, again, without understanding what makes Diablo Diablo, without understanding what makes it interesting. I'll tell you, it's not sitting there shooting the same fucking guy for 30 minutes, because that's what happens in Borderlands when you start the game. And this ugly-ass fucking quote-unquote art style, like, they just keep tiptoeing around making an actual shooter, or making an actual RPG. And this is the problem with the RTS as well. So you look at StarCraft. The single-player experience typically has you with a hero. And I think that's a mistake. But that's what you're given. You've got a hero. And if the hero dies, you lose the mission. So you typically just stuff them away in your base and hope they don't get killed by something. Like an infested Terran. Or you're going through this long, arduous, tedious, uninteresting installation map. Auto-attacking around, standing on beacons. Yeah. This is what I signed up for when I bought a real-time strategy game. So then we get the newer titles. And you know what newer titles featured in large prominence? Heroes. And smaller scale. And walking around installation maps. And standing on beacons. What you will see in large part, especially when they transitioned to 3D, and since 3D was so extremely undeveloped, even in like 2006 and 2008 and 2009 and 2014, 3D still is not ready for games. They realize they can't have big numbers in a game without it just being balls. Balls to play and balls for reads. But rather than dialing back and taking advantage of a very mature and well understood platform being 2D, they just force it in and throw in heroes, drop the scale, called an RTS, when half the time you don't even have resource collection or macro management. And in order to make up for it, they just put active abilities and steroids and stuff for you to click on the interface or use a hotkey for. Oh, there was another one I played. It was Dragon Shard. Dungeons and Dragons Dragon Shard. I think I lasted about half an hour to an hour in that one. And,
was that bad?
They're pretty fucking bad, because it always amounts to being incredibly fucking tedious, at least as far as the single player experience is concerned. And I'm not going to say that StarCraft has a good single player experience, because it doesn't. It most certainly does not. But if you use that for the basis of the standing point, then I haven't seen an RTS campaign that is really that good. And there's also Conquest Frontiers. There's another RTS. I'm actually going to talk about that one too, if we get the chance. It's like StarCraft as a standalone. People tried to make StarCraft, but it wasn't as evident as it is with World of Warcraft. Because World of Warcraft has market dominance, and it's held onto that for a very long time. And all of the attempts to dethrone it have been slapstick at best. Blizzard may not have produced a very good game, or a very functional game, or a very polished game, or a very well-written game. But they have produced a game that has sat at the top for an extremely long time. You would think if you wanted to make a competitor for that, you would try to understand why, but nobody does. Nobody ever seems to fucking sit down and do their research and figure out why this is the top. The logo is powerful, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can't dethrone it. It means you actually have to put an effort into figuring out why it's still hanging out to subscribers to this day and age. And one of the main reasons why is because there isn't actually competition. Many MMOs came out, they're all trash. So, StarCraft was not quite so one-dimensional when it came out. Its primary competitor was actually Command & Conquer, I believe. Command & Conquer predates StarCraft. It's not a very good series. I don't recommend getting into it. But it was iconic. Most people are at least familiar with Red Alert's primary themes, the Hell March. Most people would recognize Command & Conquer if they saw it. They'll also recognize Dune 2000 and earlier iterations. These were the earlier RTSs that helped shape the RTS market. And when StarCraft first came out, it wasn't a binary switch. It didn't capitalize on a non-existent Western niche. It inserted itself very prominently into the seat that Warcraft 2 had paved the way for. It was largely Korea's involvement that helped propel StarCraft. In fact, the Blizzard never touched it, and everybody else kept making just failure after failure after failure after failure that just basically cemented and immortalized StarCraft. Basically, StarCraft was very much handed its position in terms of its social surroundings. But the same problem still applied. People didn't want to make an RTS, but wanted to be seen as making an RTS. Enter Dawn of War, Company of Heroes. All these RTTs that strip away control from the player. Because the developers can't play games. They're bad. You're going to see this a lot in Blizzard with StarCraft 2 and stuff as well. Blizzard can't play their own games. Most of the time, they don't even try to play their own games. But if they wanted to play their own games, they're going to see that there's ways that they can't be good. They're going to remove those ways. They're very, very vain. You see that all over the place with World of Warcraft. I've followed World of Warcraft's patching history since it was first entering beta. It's a fucking disaster of people coming into the company, being given positions, and changing things because they want things to be a very, very specific way, and anybody else who says otherwise is wrong, and they don't give a fuck. Blizzard has a massive history of just ignoring their community in World of Warcraft, or only listening to the noisiest, smallest minority, but generally speaking, what you have is a lot of developers that are ultra heavily biased. StarCraft was exempt for this because it has very, very little actual patching going on. So, Romance Stag. So when we get into discussion about mechanics and balance and stuff like that, there is imbalances in StarCraft. There is most certainly, you know, like units and stuff which are in large part not really that great, not really that well balanced. That there could be some changes to improve them, objectively speaking. But since StarCraft has become so deeply entrenched in what many people would call a meta, a communal behavioral understanding that is formulated and fermented over years and years and years and years and years of people throwing themselves at it and coming up with their own solutions rather than patching out perceived problems. That, in large part, lays to the very, very complex history of Brood War. And anybody else who tries to make RTSs tends to completely ignore that. They look at Brood War as just being a click fest, and they want to make it not a click fest to make it more accessible. And then you've already entered the toxic mindset of, let's start removing things that require actions to use.
Well, one of the reasons why StarCraft is a fluke, by my estimation, is that Blizzard, as a developer, didn't actually understand the mechanics that they were putting into the game. And then a lot of the mechanics that they put into the game were done so out of necessity or actually by accident, more often than not, as opposed to being something that they made a conscious effort into like trying to implement. For example, if you look at how the assimilator has a different hitbox than the geyser that it's built upon, and units can move or not move past it in a wall depending on whether or not the assimilator has been placed. You know, that's something that doesn't really play into balance, you would think, but now suddenly you can make entire maps, like island maps, where Protoss and Terran, due to their refinery and assimilator sizes, have to like destroy a structure that's on top of the geyser, whereas Zerg don't. So this map is now, even though island maps are usually not very good for Zerg, now this, Zerg can now expand better in this island map and has like a more of an obvious advantage. So there's like a weird way where map makers in the scene have figured out a way to balance the races when, as you said, they are not actually very well balanced, just based on their like objective standards if it was an even playing field every time, which is an interesting way to actually balance a game competitively. And obviously, it's more, I would say, more argumentation for the idea that Blizzard didn't do this intentionally. This is something that the community had to step in.
There's a million things they didn't do intentionally. Think about drone drills. That's not intentional, and that's really simple. Workers lose collision when they enter the order for mining minerals. And July Zerg, I think, was it OSL finals he won in some year, literally off of the back of repeatedly drone drilling. I think he drone drilled a guy 2 games to win. Like out of a best of 5, 2 of his wins were drone drills. In which, if you're not familiar with a drone drill is, so usually in a map with a ramp, say for example, I think it was Protoss, his opponent was Protoss, puts a zealot in the ramp so the Zerglings can't get past the ramp. Well, what you can do is you can bunch up your Zerglings or all your workers if you really want to all in, and if you get vision on his mineral line, you can click on his minerals, suddenly your workers don't have collision anymore. And you can cancel that order when they're on top of the zealot and actually shove it off the ramp and get all your Zerglings and drones and everything else in there. Or you can just allow the drones to go straight into his base and start attacking. So 2 of the 3 wins that July had in this finals was off of the back of just all-inning and pushing things off the ramp with the drone, getting things inside his base. That was definitely never planned on Blizzard's behalf. That is what is called creative use of game mechanics. And some developers really, really hate that.
Yeah, well, you'll get into a lot of instances. I mean, League of Legends, which you brought up earlier, is a great example of this, where people will be taking advantage of animation canceling to, like, there was a point where Nidalee became a jungler back in, I think, Season 4. The specifics aren't really super important, but the idea was that you could reset Nidalee's auto attack so much, and also reset a lot of her spells so frequently, that you could actually reach absurd melee damage dealing potential, because they were too worried about the fact that her spear could one-shot people from too far away, so they decided, well, let's change her kit to be more like dive focused. And then they didn't account for the fact that skilled players, admittedly, because it did take some skill to execute all of the combos, skilled players could just one-shot everybody, and people were, not very happy with that. But again, Riot stepped in and then removed a bunch of her high skill elements like animation canceling as a response, instead of like tuning the numbers or something.
This is actually a big thing in like fighting games and stuff as well. The animation canceling thing, if you're even familiar with high-level gaming in most genres, you're going to enter things like animation canceling and stuff like that. In World of Warcraft, there was weaving, taking advantage of certain swing speeds, and I forget, there was a good explanation for HKS gave me. It's something you just intrinsically do when you're at a high level. You don't really consciously think of it. But it is actually taking advantage of basically like unintended side effects of the way certain things do. In League of Legends, there is a lot of abilities that basically give you an instant auto attack. So the optimal way to use them is to get in your auto attack and then immediately get in that ability. You're basically getting 2 auto attacks worth of damage plus the ability, because normally the auto ability resets your auto attack timer. So it's really inefficient to use it and then wait for your auto attack. If you get off your auto and then get in your base hit, that's like some extra free damage. So
yeah, it's basically a way to min-max it. Yeah. So what you're doing is you're taking, like you said, a creative use of mechanics, or in this case, just a more efficient use of those mechanics, and you're finding a way to gain some sort of competitively viable advantage on the at the highest level of competition in this case, which is what you were talking about with July doing the drone drill. So when you have a situation where the developer doesn't patch these out, which is what happened with Brood War, these are still into the game in this day. I don't think that something like that will ever happen again in the context of like a AAA game design studio, because these things will be seen as bugs as opposed to features. And it's not to say that they should never be considered bugs, but there is something to say about basically the grand experiment that was Brood War, where they had all of these bugs as features and never removed any of them.
What's most fascinating about Brood War is it has all of this stuff, and yet this is not what really creates the balancing issues that Brood War has. The balancing issues result in win rates across years and years and years and years of professional games of all caliber of like a few percentage. And even then, it's like super map dependent what those win rates actually are. But the shit that you see in Brood War and professional play is just mind-blowing. Like the Melisk stacking. Koreans have the very angle of where to attack with Melisks to get your projectiles to bounce in certain ways down to an arc.
Yeah, that's pretty insane.
Like they have all that figured out, and it's just ridiculous. I was able, at the peak of my Brood War, I was able to do the moving attack with Corsairs and Vultures.
Yeah,
and
the
that's
patrol
super
micro.
unintended. That's super unintended. But it is so extremely powerful. And at the high level, this doesn't create tremendous imbalance. That's what's the most fascinating thing about Brood War for me, because usually when you see some kind of bug like this show up in a game, it has enormous connotations. But in Brood War, there was no developer to say, hey, I'm going to disable this. The players, when these things were developed, the players had to come up with their own solution. And it all kind of evened out in the end.
Well, it's really interesting to me because you're then put in a position where, as the developer is not fixing this, if this does create an imbalance, then now the community has to step in and fix it themselves, which is where you get all of these map makers using SEM Draft, amongst other tools, to blend in like backwards ramps and actually make balanced ladder maps. And now if you don't play on the ladder, your result isn't going to be taken nearly as seriously because non-approved ladder maps aren't going to be approved to be balanced in whatever way you may have. But it's also interesting that even in that context, you still have maps that are confirmed to be like sided to one race or another, but it's just that you play in a series where, you know, one map may be Zerg sided and another map may be Terran sided, and then maybe one is neutral. And, you know, it's a best of 3, so theoretically you'll all have your opportunity to win based on the map percentages. But even then, you're talking about like a difference of, like you said, very small amounts.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because when I was watching, some really abstract maps came up. I think one of them, I don't know if it was called Plasma or whatever, it was air only until you destroyed a bunch of eggs. So this map actually had lots of air rushes and stuff in it. It was really like completely out of the ordinary. And that created some imbalances. And it was like interesting to see the Koreans go through the iteration of introducing maps into the tournament pools and then removing and then refining them. And how even like the small changes ultimately resulted in really dramatically changing the map ups. And that's another thing that's really unique to Brood War, is how important the terrain is to the balance of that game. There is no other RTS where it's balanced in such a manner where the maps make that big of a difference, because usually the other RTSs are both so volatile that, you know, you can't even attribute a lot of things to just the terrain in general, but they're balanced very homogeneously. Warcraft 3, for example, in which the terrain really doesn't have like that unique of an impact per race. I mean, a really basic example is, of course, siege tanks and ledges, but
oh yeah, they had to patch up every single tank hole in all of those cliffs when that sort of exploit started being used, and it was pretty absurd the amount of changes that alone mandated. And another interesting aspect is that you can't actually have a symmetrical map unless it's... No, I don't think you can have a symmetrical map in terms of like the resource placements, because gas does not mine the same rate if you're mining. It mines slower if you're taking it from, I think it's the top and the right. So if the gas is north or east of your command center, your SCVs will mine it slower than if it was south or west, something like that. So it's really strange, but it's those small little intricacies that, something like that I don't think is necessary for Brood War to be as good as it is, but it's also interesting that the maps still seem to be relatively balanced, despite the fact that you can't have those neat little symmetrical like layouts of resources. And also just that the worker AI for mining is just so dumb with minerals that you have to put your mineral fields in a very particular order.
Yeah. And a lot of stuff is probably really complicated to someone at a layman's level coming in. Most of it you don't really need to understand to actually start playing the game at all. The game is superficially actually incredibly easy to get into. I can't think of an RTS that is easier to get into than Brood War at this stage. And this is stuff that you really start looking at like the competitive level. And the thing is a lot of this, the big thing I want to really highlight about Brood War and a lot of these things is it really comes down to the way things interact and the behavior of things interact. A lot of these things are just like the way the game actually behaves and the way things are sort of structured, the way they feel. Even things down to like the wonky Dragoon pathing and the spider mines and the Reaver duds and all this other stuff. It's all kind of just something that's like seamlessly integrated into the game because it's just how the game functions. And when you look at the other RTSs that try to like add depth by adding clickable abilities and steroids and passives and percentage and all this other shit, that stuff always comes off as superficially tacked on. It's always just like an extra and aside to try to add extra actions arbitrarily. And it always comes at the cost of those little interactions. It always comes at the cost of having those little complicated intricacies of how things behave. Now, you can't just say that this is because pathing engines are different and there's not as many weird bugs or whatever that you can play around with. You can compensate for that by just playing around with the way things behave. Now, when StarCraft 2 was first announced and they showed the Thor and the Cobra, to me it seemed like Blizzard kind of had an understanding of that was actually what you needed to do. You wanted to have units that sort of behave uniquely, rather than throwing a bunch of actives onto everything and everything just bundles up and slams into each other and you spam abilities on cooldown with smart casting. But evidently that direction is where they went in and not the one where things behave a certain way. So StarCraft is pretty unique in that respect. Definitely pretty unique in that respect. Another thing I wanted to point out is the hard counters. So hard counters are obviously very, very destructive to strategy in general because they homogenize playstyles, they homogenize psychology, they render it so that you always have a perfect response. There's not really much thinking involved whatsoever. They obviously reduce the effect of micro and stuff like that. But StarCraft 1 actually has some pretty hefty hard counters in it. But this is actually typically where the active abilities come in. I really want to point out, like, the worst is probably Ghosts and Ultralisks. Ghosts are like actually literally worthless against Zerg unless you're nuking them, which is not really happening at high level. But Vultures is a more common one that you might think because of their concussive damage. But the thing is that all damage does full damage against shields. So Ghosts are not like entirely worthless against Protoss, but obviously a lockdown makes them incredibly useful against Protoss as well. But Vultures, the primary power budget for Vultures comes out of the Spider Mines and the attack moving. So the primary thing you do with Vultures is you don't fight Dragoons with Vultures. You outmaneuver them with Vultures.
Yeah, and you plant mines behind them and all that.
Yeah. So this is where the behavioral thing really comes in, where the interaction really comes in, is that on paper, the Vultures are pretty much worthless against Dragoons, unless you get them on top of Spider Mines. But there's so many ways that you use Vultures, and Vultures are an integral part of Terran versus Protoss, even though the Protoss is probably going to be building a lot of large units that the Vultures are otherwise not really that useful against. But Vultures can and will win you the game even without Spider Mines. That's all about maneuvering. But in a lot of RTSs, the map layouts and the unit interactions are so simple and so baseless that if you are building something that is on paper not very good against that player, you are just going to lose. So I think actually the only real exception is Supreme Commander, which doesn't really have a large amount of hard counters in it, but it has counters in the sense of tech levels. So the Supreme Commander is one of those games where there's reclaiming. So your commander and your worker can reclaim destroyed units and trees and get some resources. Supreme Commander's community felt that it was too much APM, too much clicking, and it was a negative thing that players figured out that you can reclaim while moving between building structures early into the game. They felt that those tiny little bit of resources, the little bit of advantage you get, is very negative for the game. So you do have these polarities between these communities and the developers and stuff behind it. Supreme Commander with its maximum of like 1,000 players at once at any point back in the day when it was actually released and still popular. And StarCraft, where people won't even consider outside games at all. And there's so much that happens between these games. Like, one of the things that kind of got me about Blizzard is how they said they had to break their pathing engine to get air units to behave the way they do in StarCraft 2, to try to make them behave the way they do in StarCraft 1. But they don't behave the way they do in StarCraft 1. They're actually completely fucked. And it's just like really, really messed up the direction that they took that game, when early on it seemed like they kind of had sort of an idea what they're doing, other than the mothership and the orcas and other stuff, kind of like broadery stuff like that. But when you think about like Command and Conquer, it's very static in how things interact because of how slow the game is and the way the maps and stuff are laid out. It's very, very static. But the games, a lot of these games actually tend to have very interesting ideas in them that I think that if you took the StarCraft formula and you wrapped it around some of these ideas, especially like Conquest Frontier Wars, with the way its resources and stuff like that were handled, you actually would get something really interesting. Really, really interesting. But people don't really put in that effort.
Yeah, well, if we just look at the anatomy of what Brood War actually has, right? It's got two different resources, one of which is more plentiful than the other. It has 3 races, so there's a lot of RTSs with way more races than that. Not very many with just 3, or maybe, I think maybe some races have just, or some games rather have just 4. But you'll have a lot of instances where the number of races drastically impacts balance, like any of the Dawn of War games, for example, where you just have so many races that it would basically be impossible to balance them all in a way where you already can't really see an example of 3 races alone being balanced. And I think that when you know, the idea of having more races than 3 or whatever is an interesting concept, but it's a very clear deviation from the StarCraft formula. And I don't know that you need to follow the StarCraft formula verbatim, but I think people would do well to look at how the wheel works before they try to reinvent it. You know what I'm saying? It seems like a lot of people didn't really try to understand how it worked, which goes back to our earlier conversation about the whole cargo cult thing.
Yep.
There's a large number of Korean clones of StarCraft. One of them was called...
Large number of Korean clones of everything, actually.
Oh, yeah, big surprise. One of them was called Aatrox, not the League of Legends champion, just one A. Another one was called Armageddon, which may have actually been Brazilian. I know one of these is Brazilian. And then there's Vital Organ, which is actually an RTS that's set inside a human body, which is somewhat interesting. So, you know, none of these are really super remarkable on their own, besides maybe some wonky premises, but very many of them are, again, sort of cargo cult interpretations of StarCraft, where they were really interested in the game and they really liked it and they wanted to make their own version of it, and yet they didn't really understand how it worked. So again, looking at how it works, you know, you've got 3 races, you've got 2 resource types, and, you know, each race has about I would say most races in the game, I would imagine, have around the same number of units in terms of their diversity. Although Terran notably has less buildings in a normal sense, they also have add-ons, so it probably evens out all the time. But all 3 races have very unique mechanics in the way that they interact with the game space. You've got Protoss that need pylons, you've got Zerg that need creep, you've got Terran structures that can lift off. But it's interesting that all of the races have so many unique elements to them, and yet they all play the game in fundamentally a very similar way. At least they interact with the game world in a similar way, despite having all of these unique elements. And it's not to say your playstyle isn't different between the different races, because it is. But it's interesting that a lot of other races, like if you just look at Warcraft 3, you've got humans and orcs that feel very, very similar to one another and don't really have that many unique elements, you know, at least as a layman. I could be wrong about that. But then you've got night elves and undead that interact with the world in an entirely different manner, with the way that they, you know, undead has their own version of creep, and their workers behave like probes, and then wisps actually behave like drones, but night elves can build anywhere. And the way that they deal with gold mines as well is very different than the humans and the orcs, so it almost feels like there's 2 clashing ideas of how an RTS race should behave in Warcraft 3 when you compare it to StarCraft 1, and all of them are different, as opposed to some of them feeling more similar than others. So I'm just sort of interested in how we could parse the information of what Brood War's anatomy is compared to other RTSs, and really try and figure out where these ones went wrong. Because we talked about like patching and balance decisions, and how a lot of developers today are really, really trigger happy to fix bugs that could just end up being used as features or exploits or whatever. And also to completely change how the overall game works if they see something that they don't like about it personally. the way that they, the game is being played in a way that they don't want it to be played, and not just allowing it to evolve that way naturally. So we've talked about that aspect, but just in terms of the mechanics themselves, you mentioned that you played some RTSs that have unique ideas or interesting ideas. How would you compare those to Brood War's method itself?
Well, when you start changing something and you start adding things and removing things, you always ask, what's a meaningful addition or change? And so when I think about what is the closest to StarCraft and how I can draw from that, really Armies of Exego comes up. Because Armies of Exego put in the underground, which is like a nod from Heroes of Might and Magic. And that was, I think Dragon Shard also has underground. But for Armies of Exego is more seamless. And that, to me, was really interesting to say, because I like that idea of having the different map layers and stuff like that. It seems like something could have been really interesting. Unfortunately, they didn't really make use of it in the campaign that much. There's plenty of maps with it, but it's usually very non-interactive.
Yeah, I would say it's usually an afterthought, it seems like.
The static nature of their missions and their AI they're using. But that was really interesting. So, now look at Conquest Frontier Wars. So in all likelihood, nobody here has any idea what Conquest Frontier Wars is. So Conquest Frontier Wars is very much a clone of StarCraft in terms of the writing sense. It's got the Mantis, which are the Zerg. It's got the Solarons, which are the Protoss. And it's got the Terrans, which are the Terrans. Go figure. And then that's where the similarities end. It is a 3D game, but it's in a 2D platform. You play it in space. It's a space game, actually. And when you play like a big melee game, you've got your maps. Now, there's not really much in the way of terrain for this, except stuff like cover. So everybody's familiar with Dawn of War, and it's very binary cover. Well, that's what this game has, except we're talking asteroid fields and nebula and stuff like that. So this game's full of these zones in the maps, these fields of just stuff. And those contain your resources, by the way, minerals and gas. But there's another there's another resource too. There's the population. So you got 3 resources: minerals, gas, population. Population is on planets. Planets have build slots. You build your structures on the planets themselves, physically. Each map is connected by wormholes. And a map can have 1 wormhole, or it could have 5 or 6 wormholes. So you could almost think of it as something like Master of Orion or one of those mud games where there's just like warp gates all over the fucking place that lead to random places, or even Heroes of Might and Magic if each monolith led to an actual map. And that's basically what this is. So that was very, very different. Very, very different from StarCraft. You didn't have the positional stuff because things attacked while moving, but they had directional attacks in most cases, if I remember. It's been a while since I played it, but there was no hero. Oh, yes, there was heroes. Yes, there was. I forgot all about that until now. It's been like 15, 16 years since I played this game. So this game has heroes. They can die permanently. When they die, they're gone. The heroes are actually admirals. And the admirals give auras and other effects, and you can put them onto any ship. It's as if you could make your fucking Lich as undead, and he was just a unit that you could fasten onto a ghoul or a crypt fiend or an abomination, and then his effects applied to that unit and everything around them. That is what these guys were. Some of them had bonuses for specific ships, but otherwise they were basically like your support units. There was another resource too. Supply. This is one of those games with limited ammunition. So you had supply ships and resupply stations and stuff like that. So as an RTS, it certainly didn't require anywhere near the level of skill that Brood War does to play quite competently. But it had a lot of neat stuff in it. Unfortunately, this is one of those developers that really made a lot of mistakes in who they were taking for their publishing partners. Because they got shoveled around fucking everywhere. I remember having talks with, I don't know if he was the CEO, but he was one of the lead developers. And the laments about their publisher woes because they were shackled up with Microsoft and Ubisoft and all these shitty publishers who didn't want to have anything really to do with them. and they didn't really have any budget and other stuff like that. And it was just one of those like Armies of Exego moments where it's like, wow, this could have been really good, but you guys made some really poor decisions in who to try to publish your game. That was like the height of publishers are the devil, and it was really a shining example of that. But what did this game add to the RTS formula that was really interesting? Well, it had supply, and so did Earth 2150, and I think Earth 2160 did as well. And typically, supply in games is really fucking annoying. It's one of those tedious things that just really like pulls you away from really what's going on. But there's supply ships in these games. All these games, Earth 2160 and co. as well. Supply is actually its own little thing that's going on. It's usually rather automated. So in Conquest Interiors, you have supply ships. They basically have an aura that keeps things supplied. It's very simple. But it's actually viable to destroy supply instead of fighting a fleet up front. And to let them drain the resources, especially on carriers. So there's carriers that kind of like function like StarCraft carriers, except only specific weapons can actually attack interceptors. So there's another kind of unexpected but still somewhat unique interaction. Unlike in StarCraft, where if you EMP and stim all your Marines, you're probably going to end up killing all the interceptors. Or StarCraft 2, where interceptors don't even restore their shields, and they just tend to die willy-nilly and drain your resources for no good reason. So those are the two RTSs I'd say I really looked at. But when I look at the formula, like I look at Spellforce. So I said I tried to do an LP of Spellforce, because I really wanted to try out some of these RTSs around the Age of Warcraft 3 to see what developers were trying to do with the Blizzard formula, because that's really what was going on here, is people trying to make their own Warcraft 3. And I figured that although they were probably really shitty games, they probably had some really neat ideas in them. Spellforce has some interesting bits about it. For example, the graphics in Spellforce are like just like Armies of Exego, it's way better than Warcraft 3 and everything except for the particle effects. Warcraft 3's graphics are really, really dated for its era. They're kind of like Bubsy 3D tier. And Spellforce is one of those games that was like, we really need to make this an RPG and not an RTS. But we have RTS in it, and as an RTS, holy fuck. What a disaster of a game. There's like units like teleporting around and everything. And then there's the towers. So before I played Spellforce, I'd come across a review that said, basically towers are the devil. And I thought, well, you just build siege weapons, right? This game, as far as I got, didn't have siege weapons. And there's a mission where there's like 6 towers between you and the destination, on top of basically a bunch of bosses. I think it took me close to 3 hours to kill most of those towers, because you could build a full food army and not even get a tower down to half health, because nothing did any damage to the towers, and the towers did insane damage to you. And because the AI has infinite resources and just kept pissing out workers and shit and trying to rebuild, I just built my towers in front of their towers, and towers can't attack each other. So it was just like this meat grinder.
It sounds like a very well balanced experience.
It was great. It was absolutely fantastic. It would have been like your first encounter with 60 Reapers and a single lurker, like Riki Hanajase. And yeah, like when I look at all these games that came off of Brood War, what's really missing from them is finesse. The interaction and controls. There's none of that at all. It's always binary shit like hard counters and other crap. It always feels so forced. And anything that gets added onto it, like heroes and stuff, are always so like needlessly convoluted, where they feel like they have to have features to make it a game, so they ignore all the basics like the controls and shit like that, and focus instead on just adding abilities and auras and passive effects and items and creep camps and all this just other shit that doesn't even belong in an RTS to begin with, to try to distract from the fact they actually really don't know what they're doing. And I'd be really curious to know what kind of mindset Blizzard's developers had, like the core developers actually really designing the game in StarCraft, because I feel like that when they were making StarCraft, they kind of were not really even treating it as a job at that stage. I feel like that they kind of just were just riding off the high of Warcraft 2's success and wanted to make another RTS. And then they got slapped when people said, hey, this is just Warcraft 2 in space. Why don't you put some effort into this? And then they kind of like started downing alcohol and came back on Tuesday morning and were like, shit, let's pull our shit together. And then you see the evolution, all those like development screenshots, the evolution of StarCraft, and some of the versions never got published. With the turning units and stuff like that. Some of those are really, really fascinating because that technology would have been kind of interesting to see in motion. Maybe it didn't look very good. There's a reason why they didn't keep it, but it shows that they went through a lot of actual like stages.
Well, I can pull the curtain back a little bit on the turning units at the very least. That and the directional shield impact were pulled because they didn't have enough space on the disc.
Well, that excuse was sure ditched aside for Diablo 2 now, wasn't it? So that's kind of funny. That is funny. There is a lot of limitations like that on older hardware. Obviously, when you look at stuff like building things for cartridges for old games, the space is its own thing. But cartridges are way more powerful than CDs because you can have some control over the hardware, I think. So there was some flexibility in that regards. But it's kind of fascinating that a lot of things that were going on to see how Brood War evolved, how they like took in feedback and changed stuff. And now when you look at StarCraft 2, the only difference between its alpha and now is they adjusted some of the settings in the lighting tab. And they used a few different models and changed some data values, and that was kind of it, actually. Yeah. You can still see all the bugs and stuff that were happening with the old version in the new version today. And StarCraft 2 is just obviously a hacked apart Warcraft 3. It's literally the exact same engine with some middleware tacked on, and that's about it. And they turned JAS into something that's even slower and less efficient than JAS, which is quite an accomplishment, I think. So when you look at these development cycles, you see a very different shift. Blizzard responds to StarCraft 2 looking cartoony by slightly changing the color value, as opposed to actually really changing what's wrong with the graphics altogether, them being 3D and the proportions and everything like that being completely fucked. They didn't try to make it more like StarCraft. They actually ended up going in the opposite direction, so they didn't respond to that at all. And then that was it. Actually, they tried to deceive people during their videos. They used sharpening filters on their battle reports. I still have access to those videos, and I still look at them every now and then. It's amazing that Blizzard realized that DivX looks blurry as fuck. The game looks blurry as fuck. It looks like a low-quality piece of shit because that's what it is. So they tried to kind of hide that by throwing sharpening filters onto the video. It's really fascinating to see them go through the effort of trying to hide things and deceive people, rather than in Brood War, where the original StarCraft, where they tried to actually improve. And there was like real evidence of them like exploring, at least. And I think that's actually really a big thing. Like the core fundamentals that leads to things like the cargo cult and derivatives and stuff not really working is, I think that a lot of these derivative RTSs, they came in with like an idea, like they saw an RTS and they had an idea how to change it, but they didn't really explore it that much because they probably weren't really pressured to do so, or they didn't really care to do so. And when you talk about like what makes Brood War a skill testing game, a competitive game, and then you look at the newer iterations, I think you can't go too far without running into the arguments about MBS and auto mining and stuff like that. Because those were really at the forefront of when like Warcraft 3 came out and StarCraft 2 came out. People were like, MBS is going to kill the game because it removes skill expression, which is true. There is mechanical skill expression in executing this or that, and you sort of enter a murky territory when you start arguing, is this actually meaningful skill expression or no? But obviously what killed Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2 was the fact they weren't really good games to begin with. Whereas Armies of Exego, I think, is a pretty decent game in itself. And the changes it makes to the user interface are positive from StarCraft. I think that Armies of Exego sits between the line of adding user interface changes that remove skill expression, but then adding changes that are actually improving the original formula. Being able to take buildings you've queued up and adding them to a control group and stuff like that comes down to like the quality of life thing. And I don't think things like multi-building select and all these other sort of superficial arguments really hold any water in defining whether or not an RTS is really actually that good or not. Because when you think of like Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2, their problems are... They've got problems far exceeding the scale of that long before you even start talking about the user interface. I don't think there's really been a lot of RTSs I've played that have really bad user interfaces, except for games like Command & Conquer, where their user interfaces are absolutely abhorrent. And Supreme Commander and Supreme Commander 2. Supreme Commander 2 is definitely at the top of some of the worst user interface I've ever used in an RTS. But I think really what defines StarCraft, if you really want to look at it from like the, you know, past the numbers and the visuals and stuff like that, it really comes down to the interactions, how things interact and how expression is handed to the player. So I did a video a while ago in which I was discussing action RPGs like Devil May Cry, and I showed Pornago this video a while ago so that he could familiarize himself with it. And I used StarCraft as a centerpiece for that video, because I was talking about how things like God of War were destructive from Devil May Cry by turning skill expression into QuickTime events. And I got into what makes a meaningful expression. And I was talking about things like greedy plays and stuff like that, which is things you hear a lot about, like League of Legends and stuff. People talk about greedy plays. And I think what makes StarCraft, like I said, what makes StarCraft really engaging is how seamless these experiences are. You could be a low-level player, like shit tier, like bronze. And then you could be Grandmaster. And the differences largely come down to in how you're interacting with the exact same systems and how seamless those systems are. I'm talking about things like the Melisks bunching up in the drone drills and stuff like that. Those are all a part of the game mechanics you're already interacting with at the low level. And this is true for a lot of games as well. But the thing is that in order to master those things, you do have to practice and acquire discipline. Discipline is what enables greed to have sort of a scaling impact. If you're low level and you're greedy, you usually just get slapped. But if you're super disciplined and can make more practice greedy plays, be more aggressive, it ultimately scales up in terms of its potential rewards. For example, July drone drilling a second time was just absolutely insane. That he would be ballsy enough to do that at the finals of a tournament and attempt that again. Because if you fuck that up, you've lost all your workers and you basically have thrown the game. It's very, very all in. And it was just incredible to see him do this. These 3 very, very short games. And him just to make these ballsy plays like that, to be so bold. The expression allows a lot of variance in how things are controlled. So we were talking about pathfinding a little while ago. You were talking about, because of the way StarCraft 2 behaves, in which units automatically bunch together and always pick the absolute most efficient routes, that this removes a lot because the positional play is so important in StarCraft 1, where manipulating each individual unit is super, super important. And this was a discussion that came from discussing about squads. Because
Yes.
a squad is effectively 1 unit controlling 5 units. You have no fucking control over those 5 units whatsoever. It's just moving as a body. It takes a huge chunk out of your control.
Yes. So the issue with squads is for sure that it completely deprives the player of any ability to interact with those individual units on an individual scale. And you said that you've actually seen an example of squads that you didn't feel detracted from the overall experience. I have never personally seen a game.
Only in Civilization and stuff like that, where squads are just visual, basically.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I've never experienced an RTS, like real-time ability to control units, and I've never experienced squads working out in that sort of capacity. And the pseudo squad thing that I brought up was related to Warcraft 3 and how they have this formation system that even when you toggle it off, it just stops them from waiting for the formation. They still go into the formation, so you essentially have to select every unit individually, which is obviously not what you want to do in an RTS. So theoretically, if you're going to end up essentially taking control away from the player, you're reducing their ability to express any skill they may have. And that's my big umbrage that I take with any sort of squad mechanic or like automatic pathing. So the reason why I think Brood War's pathing is actually positive, everybody memes about it and says like, oh, it's just garbage. You know, it's very clunky. There's certainly some elements of it that are clunky, and whether or not you could mitigate those without removing what makes it good is maybe another element of discussion to be talked about at a later time. But just in the terms of what I think is good about it is that it makes you responsible for ordering your units in an intelligent fashion. Now, StarCraft 2 technically does this too, because clumping up your units is rarely actually the proper way to play, but it's still an abstraction on top of an abstraction. Pathfinding is an invisible system that players have to sort of visualize how it works just after months and years of playing the game, and that's the only way they're really going to figure out how to make it work. But in StarCraft 2 and Warcraft 3, there's these other fundamental behaviors that you won't be able to get used to nearly as fast because they're engine-level behaviors that like intercept the orders that you give a unit and basically override it in some capacity. So this is like, especially with Warcraft 3, the pseudo-squad mechanic of the formation, where you ordered a unit to move to a specific spot, and it removes precision by hijacking that order and then relocating their destination, their waypoint. And in StarCraft 2, units just naturally clump together instead of like trying to walk around each other like they do in Brood War, and I guess in Warcraft 3 as well. So I would generally say that the reason why Brood War is superior in its pathfinding is because it forces skill expression to, it basically enforces the utility of micromanaging your army efficiently to make sure that all of the units are entering the battlefield relatively at the same time, or at a desired time if you want some units to enter in afterwards. Things like putting your wounded units behind your allied units and stuff. StarCraft 2 will just automate this and make sure that they all go in at the same time, essentially. And Warcraft 3 will obviously have this formation issue, at least when you're moving before you attack move. So, just in terms of the pathing, I think that because Brood War allows you to be the most precise, but also expects you to sort of micromanage your army at a more higher level if you want to actually be successful, that's what makes it good, as opposed to, Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2 sort of automating some of it for you in ways that make it a lot harder to really understand how the system works, because it's another layer of abstraction placed over the pathfinding idea in general. So that's sort of my take on the pathfinding and why I think Brood Wars is superior.
Yeah, so StarCraft 2 also has the whole smart collision thing, and I always found when testing my campaign that getting precise positioning on my tanks and stuff was an absolute pain in the ass because of the way things tried to move around with each other. Warcraft 3 has a lot of issues with units like spinning around when they try to move past each other too, so I suppose that since Blizzard just copy-pasted Warcraft 3, they probably had a lot of issues with units spinning around and decided to throw in that smart collision thing instead, which is actually an extremely CPU-hungry system. If you take a blank map, and spawn 100 Zerglings and have them patrol back and forth, you'll find that when they start running into each other, the game frame rate will actually just plummet. So it's very, very expensive, and needlessly expensive too, considering it's a 2D engine. Shouldn't be any more expensive than StarCraft 1, other than some extra turning dimensions. But yeah, so StarCraft 1 has just like a lot of these interactions, but since it's so raw, they all just kind of come subconsciously. You're not going to know about the Melisk attack angle and stuff unless you do like serious research into it, but you are going to know about the movements of the Melisks and stuff like that, and how this can really impact stuff quite a bit. And the advanced techniques, like the grouping the overlords and the larvae and stuff like that to bunch them up, is obviously something you probably aren't going to be doing when you first start the game. But you will, however, learn that air units can stack into each other very easily. StarCraft 2's air stacking is absolutely fucked, though. So it's there's just like bizarre things that happen that are kind of in the same vein as being like the engine doing strange things, but it usually results in like very unexpected behavior in other titles. Like, it's hard to really like tackle a subject of mechanics, because I think that the mechanics that most games add are not so much mechanics as they are chores. So, take for example StarCraft 2. Blizzard added in MBS and thought that they had basically removed your need to look at your base. Never mind the fact that because the game had less units and stuff like that, and you know, things built so much faster and all this other stuff, you didn't really need to pay attention to your base anyways. Since the maps were smaller and the units were bigger, this as well, like that, it all is like a bunch of little things that played together. So Blizzard said, we want you to pay attention to your base, so we're going to give you something that you absolutely have to use to get the most amount of efficiency. But it's an arbitrary thing. It's, you have to use this. You have to push this button. You just have to. Otherwise, you know, at a competitive level, you're going to lose. Like Chrono Boost, Larva Injection, and Mules and stuff like that. You just have to use it. So it's a chore. It's tedious. Whereas in StarCraft 1, your skill expression and the APM and stuff like that isn't just about pushing the buttons. It's about how you manage your time. The skill ceilings are expressed extremely differently. So in StarCraft 1, some professional players are super good at micro and not as good at macro. Even at an incredibly high level with a lot of APM, there's still going to be divergences in that, because it is actually like impossible to play StarCraft perfectly. You can't do every single thing at once, because there is a lot to do at once. Microing those mutalisks to get them all stacked up and keep them stacked up takes a lot of energy and time. And on top of that, then you got to be managing things. So the difference with StarCraft 2 is a lot of this stuff is actually now arbitrary, where you absolutely have to do this because now this is a chore that you have to do. Whereas in StarCraft 1, you can see plenty of professional games where it's like idle workers and stuff, and the guy is still winning. And he's still winning by a huge margin, because of the way he's devoting his mental energy is very different. Whereas in StarCraft 1, because it's so much smaller scale, the necessary APM to play at a high level, the necessary things you need to do are far fewer. The way things interact is a lot, you know, shallower. It highlights the needs for these macro mechanics. So rather than Blizzard trying to introduce more like unique behaviors into things, making the interactions between the existing stuff more meaningful, they added in the macro mechanics, as they're called. So what's a mechanic? Well, you can think of a mechanic as something the player interacts with the game. It's like a bridge between the game and the player. It is not the game itself. A mechanic is not the game itself. A mechanic is an expression. So say, for example, in League of Legends, there is this obsession with mini-games. Mini-games always almost amount to hitting 3 times to get an effect. So the mechanic is to move in and hit 3 times. And then you stun or slow or some other copy-pasted garbage from their myriad of new champions. You get some massive steroid off of it. Or a stun or something like that. So this is a mechanic. But as a game interaction, it doesn't really offer a lot to you as the player using it. It only offers something to your opponent, because in some cases your opponent can choose not to interact with you. So that in itself is a negative thing. You don't want things that discourage interaction, but that's what this kind of stuff does. But even then, when you look at the macro mechanics, they actually add nothing at all. They're actually literally worthless, because they're just cooldowns you are just forced to use, or otherwise end up with a suboptimal result. Because they're all things that basically just amount to doing something faster. Getting more resources faster, building Protoss stuff faster, getting more larvae basically faster. And if you don't use these on cooldown, you're losing efficiency. So it's a chore. It's a timed chore. Ideally, when you're looking at a game, you're looking at something with as few mechanics in this sense as possible. What you want something is that translates expression into game world experience right away. And that is precisely what a lot of the stuff in Brood War does. That's what Vulture Dancing does. That's what Boxer's Immortal Marines do. That's what Hold Position does. That's what the Patrol Micro does. That's what the, you know, the Magic Box and the Drone Drills and all this other stuff is using something that's existing that's straight up. It's not arbitrary. It's an interaction. It's the player manipulating something. And it's true that a lot of those things that are being manipulated are very unintentional, but because of the fact they were static, intentional or not, became irrelevant. They were something that was a part of the game and had to be treated as a part of the game, regardless of what the original developer intended. So, for better or for worse, these are now quote-unquote mechanics, but they're not mechanics in the arbitrary sense. Not in every game are you going to see a drone drill. Not in every game are you going to see, you know, these specific unique things abused to massive extent. But they are a part of the game, so they do exist. Too many times do you see developers, be they modders or commercial developers, think that in order to make something skill testing and competitive and be an esport, we've got to throw in complicated mechanics to represent skill expression. Mechanics come at the cost of player interaction with the game. Rather than making the economy system in StarCraft 2 actually have interactive elements, for example, removing auto mining and stuff like that, they added in something arbitrary as a chore to do instead, while having auto mining that removes something. Basically, Blizzard creates a problem for themselves. They try to duct tape back together to make casuals feel happy about not having to click on their minerals, but giving everybody the same chore of having to push a cooldown every 30 or so seconds. Everybody loses. Nobody gains anything. The mechanics aren't necessarily something overarching like the macro mechanics either. I also think that all hero systems amount to the exact same thing. Experience and veterancy all amounts to the exact same thing. Some of these things may make sense on a conceptual stage on paper. In practice, they always amount to the same thing. They're detracting from the experience of unit versus unit interaction. You want that unit versus unit interaction. When you're thinking about a shooter and two people shooting each other in something like Quake or Unreal Tournament, it comes down to what weapons they're using, what position they're using, if they know where each other is, how accurate they are, what their reflexes are. It comes down to the players, their elements, and very specifically their interactions. When you look at StarCraft, you look at something like feedback versus snipe, it's all about just who clicks this button faster. And maybe if you have detection. And it's just you push a button, stuff happens. The power expression comes without interaction. And I think that StarCraft 1, like this is one of the things I would say StarCraft 1 has a lot of problems with, is the you know, one button press massive return on budget. Especially stuff like Stasis Field and Plague and, you know, stuff like that in Lockdown. These very, very binary effects. Yeah. But go ahead.
No, I was agreeing with you. I was saying Irradiate is one of them.
Yeah,
anything that has
like
a crazy delay. I mean, Lockdown and Stasis Field have the same duration, and it's like 2 minutes or something. It's like a minute at least.
It's crazy. So you have these insanely long CC effects and stuff like that. But the way is that with StarCraft, if you remove those right now, you would cause massive problems because StarCraft has got this sort of like lopsided, unbalanced balance thing going on, where because, like I said, because of the way it is, even if you could change these things and make objective improvements to it, they actually would result in massive subjective, negative connotations and would ultimately end up damaging the game as a whole because of the fact that it's so static. So you can't just like walk in and change these things because they're kind of stupid. So it's something you would take a note from making something like a StarCraft 2, which I think Blizzard did to an extent. But unfortunately, we still do have a lot of really stupid things in that game that result in very binary interactions. The Immortal is one of the worst. And the Colossus and stuff like that are all just extremely badly designed. The concepts have merit, but the execution is always where Blizzard fails the most. Because these units reject interaction by the extent of their binary interactions. The Immortal always reduces this much damage. You know, the Colossus is either insanely effective or utterly worthless, stuff like that. There's just way too much of this stuff and way too much of one button press interactions and very, very arbitrary shit. Very, very arbitrary shit. And then there's the hit scan as well. So this is something else that's not very high sung that's worth bringing up early, is the difference between StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 with siege tanks, especially. So in StarCraft 2, there's something called hit scan. I mean, there's a lot of games with hit scan, but this is like a smart hit scan. And what it says is that you cannot overkill. So say if you have 10 siege tanks and a single Zergling walks up, only the one siege tank is going to fire to kill it. In StarCraft 1, if they're all in range, they're all going to fire. StarCraft 2 also has random variations on cooldowns as well. So there's some RNG thrown in there for you as well. And
really? I had no idea.
Yeah, if you look at the periods for a lot of stuff, I remember looking at them. They may have changed it since I looked at them, but I remember seeing random variations in cooldowns and other such things. And the hit scan thing is insane. So this is why siege tanks are now 3 supply and do a pittance of damage in StarCraft 2 compared to StarCraft 1, even though the HP values and everything like that skyrocketed to absolutely absurd levels. Blizzard in numbers. It's always got to be bigger. Except for siege tanks, because they would be absolutely fucking monstrously broken. Because they can't actually overkill, which means that when you throw a horde of Zerglings at siege tanks, they're actually insanely efficient at killing them, as opposed to StarCraft 1, where they're actually not really that great at all. So there's a lot of like interactions like this that they fit into the category of being interactions, of being the subtle behavioral stuff. But this is something actually a lot more invisible than a lot of stuff going on in StarCraft 1. It's pretty damn clear when somebody's got their Melisks bunched together or is drone drilling you. But the hit scan thing is like this invisible interaction that's really unexpected. You really don't expect to see that. You really expect you throw one Zergling in to get everything to fire because I've entered your range, you're going to fire. Like that's like a very expected and realistic expectation. But that's not actually what happens. That is not what happens. So there's just like little bizarre behavioral things like that as well that just kind of like it kind of like boggles the mind why they do that. And but they do that. So that's most certainly one of the reasons why they would never actually add Scourge to the game, is because Blizzard probably doesn't even know how to make them not hit scan. It's quite possible, but I doubt Blizzard knows how to do that. Seeing as Blizzard didn't even know how to fix their own AI, they were begging us to tell them how to fix it when we fixed it in StarCraft. It was funny. So, it's, yeah. It's hard for me to put into words, but I think the pathing example that you gave is that can be broadly applied to a lot of things in StarCraft, actually. The hit scan thing really applies to that. In StarCraft 2, the game is basically saying, hey, you would overkill here, but I'm going to just help you out and say you didn't. In StarCraft 1, there's no such hand-holding at all. So if you're entering that situation where somebody's really abusing that, you kind of have to place your siege tanks better.
Well, I think another issue related to like, intuitively understanding things based on the immediate, like, you have an expectation versus reality, and you conduct a test. You immediately you have some sort of like hypothesis based on what's going to happen, and especially if you're working on a sequel, which is what StarCraft 2 is. You would expect that some of the mechanics would remain the same across the different games, but I can't actually think of very many mechanics that remain the same either. So that's like a big problem as far as I can tell.
It's really funny too, because you can think about it. Zerglings in StarCraft 2 are very shitty compared to StarCraft 1, but they weren't always like that. They were actually insanely efficient because of the pathing. Because in StarCraft 1, there's an amount of time it takes for Zerglings to actually surround something. But in StarCraft 2, surrounds are so easy to do. It's all completely automated. And it made Zerglings just, like, especially in, like, beta, before things got really stupid, Zerglings were just so insanely good because of how fast they would surround something. If anyone tried to run from Zerglings, they were just completely fucked. And then there's the unholy trinity, the Roach, Marauder, Immortal, that everybody is well aware of. The just absolute insanity of these 3 units that just have so much health and so much damage, and they all counter each other, and it just is this really awful interaction that just shaped the game. When initially the concepts for the Roach and stuff like that weren't even really that bad. I heal a lot when I'm underground, and I move when I'm underground. Well, okay, that's kind of an interesting idea. But in reality, Roaches were just like these unkillable fucking tanks that just did like some of the highest damage in the game from Brood War to this point. And now we need something that can counter this. So again, Blizzard fabricates for themselves a problem and has to heavily-handedly try to solve it. And now you've got the Marauder, which is just this incredibly stupid unit. Just stupid all around. And then the Immortal on top of it. It's just awful. And now apparently Adepts as well.
Yeah, those are like the next in line. It's basically like an organic immortal, anti-light immortal. Like if Protoss had vultures that didn't have any interactivity based on their spells or movement.
To me, it's kind of like StarCraft 2 is in that utility creep race, whereas in Brood War, they just kind of threw things together they thought looked or sounded or appeared neat. Like,
yeah, there's a certain understanding of what a thematic appreciation for like a certain race's identity. Like a power fantasy of controlling the Zerg compared to controlling the Protoss is a very different power fantasy, and it seems like most of the stuff that they have works relatively well to like, I guess, fortify that idea and really like sell that to you.
Yep.
Whereas in StarCraft 2, I don't really feel like I'm controlling an endless Zerg swarm because the Terrans have more units than I do. So it's like I don't know.
Yeah, well, it's like it also comes down to the whole esports thing. People try to make an esports, they don't try to make a game, and they wonder why their product fails spectacularly because the most successful esports didn't start off as an esport. They were games that people enjoyed and then started playing competitively, and then they rose up to become esports. That was the case with StarCraft. It was the case with League of Legends. It was the case with Dota. It was the case with Counter-Strike. It was the case with Team Fortress. These games had an origination that was rather humble. And then they became an esport by the extent of being really popular. But now everybody's like, oh, hey, their game is an esport, so I'm going to make an esport. And then they end up with something that is entirely unattractive, unenjoyable to play, and then they throw money at it to try to make it successful. StarCraft 2. And overweight.
Yeah, well, you actually referenced the whole like Korean economy thing at the beginning of the podcast. You mentioned that the Korean economy sort of helped fortify StarCraft as an an esports game. And that was, I think, as far as I understand it, their government has some sort of like legal jurisprudence over the whole like upkeep and creation in the first place of their internet connection. I don't know the exact legalities of it, but that's why their internet is really good
from the States.
Yeah, it's essentially like that's why their internet is the caliber of internet that it is at the price that they have to pay for it. So it's pretty good deal for them. But they usually, at least at the time of Brood War's release, the average family didn't actually have a computer, so they would go to these LAN cafes, these PC bongs, and 420 it up. And one of the things
PC Bang, I thought it was called, but
well, it's apparently pronounced bong, even though it's spelled with an A. I don't know.
Oh, what do you know? 420.
Yeah, it's the hidden message. So they basically have this cultural like mechanic as a culture themselves, as a society themselves. They have this thing where they have this communal area and they all go and play. And these PCs, in order to stay competitive, all of these different LAN cafes have all of the latest games installed. So essentially, StarCraft was just on these LAN cafe PCs. Everybody was paying to play for an hour or 2 hours or whatever, and they all tried StarCraft because they didn't actually have to buy the game. They just had to pay like a rental service to play on the PC for a short amount of time.
This communal thing is also what helped really cement StarCraft because of the names behind it. Anybody who is really familiar with StarCraft is going to know of Flash. They're going to know of Bizu. They're going to know of Jaedong. These people and their rivals and their legacies are at the forefront of StarCraft as well. Like whenever I think of StarCraft, I think of like Jaedong and Flash and even Savior and even like all the scandals that Savior and Co were involved in. And because this is what it was about. In large part, once you got past the absurdity of professionally playing a game. Like when I was first introduced to professional StarCraft, I had been modding for years. Years and years and years and years and years. I think it was like 2006 or 2007. I first discovered that there was actually, like, it was really late that I discovered StarCraft was played professionally. So I watched some videos, and I was just bamboozled that there is people on a stadium with 20,000 fans physically watching them play this game that I have been modding for a good chunk of my life. I was absolutely floored by that, especially since it was Korea. And that was like one of the biggest inspirations for me to get into casting was the Korean commentators. I've always tried to capture that energy that they had, and their game knowledge as well, because the Korean casters are actually extremely knowledgeable in the game. And I've always seen that as like my goal to reach. And it was just surreal. And then that got me introduced to like Boxer and Bizu and stuff like that, and these names. And then you look up all the shenanigans. Like Boxer is obviously one of the biggest of them all. You know, his legend and all the like the crazy things that he's done. I thought, wow, people play this game at this level. I didn't know you could do this stuff, and I've been modding this for like 7 or 8 years by this point. And then I started thinking, how can I make content for these kinds of people? Like, how can I push myself to learn what they're doing? So that's when I started trying to like learn how to do this stuff. That's why I learned how to do like the attack moving and stuff like that, and taking advantage of these things and bettering myself as a player, because until then I'd always just done things just to make things, just to make stuff like for my writing or whatever, and make mods and total conversions and shit. And I hadn't really thought of it as like making something super skill testing. Obviously my mods were way more difficult than anything else because they had custom AI, and I was always developing stuff like that, but I hadn't thought of the game as being something that in depth in terms of how you can interact with it, in terms of how this game with super simple mechanics, just units you just move around with your mouse and attack, how you can control these at such a fine-tuned level. It is just always incredible for me to see. And that was not an experience I would ever share with any other game except for Counter-Strike and Quake and Unreal Tournament, because the precision that people have in those games is absolutely insane. And then obviously I played a lot of Blizzard Dota and a lot of League, and I started getting really good with my precision. And then I like kind of backported that to my RTS, and I thought, wow, StarCraft really is actually incredible, because you can do this kind of stuff in that game, and it's this old, and it still tests you that much when you're at a high level. Like, it's something you appreciate the more you get into it. Like, that's why I always, whenever somebody asks me about like what to look at when starting to make a project or whatever, I say Brood War professional gameplay. Just watch Korean VODs. Don't worry about what they're saying. Just worry about what's going on, because you'll figure out what's going on just by watching it. Because there is no better instructional device on how to make a good game. Because what you're seeing is actually what's going on. There's nothing really invisible going on that you're not going to see as a spectator with StarCraft. And it's so easy to read and so easy to follow. If you look at something like StarCraft 2, a good portion of it is hidden behind hidden button presses, the macro mechanics and stuff like that, and the not so obvious spellcasts, and the reads are absolutely horrible. It's such an awful game to watch. And it's not really that great. I think Warcraft 3 is okay to watch, though. I've watched a little bit of that, and it's like interesting to see some different forks of some things. It's obviously not Brood War, but it can still be interesting. Some of the things you linked me were kind of interesting, but this is more like a casual game, even at the professional level. And
yeah, well, certainly in the way that we judge Brood War competitive play with like the high APMs and like the focus on mechanically outmaneuvering your opponent, whereas it seems, anyways, from my brief delve into what competitive Warcraft 3 is, it's less about the micro stuff and a whole lot more about like planning your strategies out and developing some sort of proper counter when you
Druids
scout
of the
out
Talon.
Yes. Well, that is like even amongst professional players, like the videos that I was sending you, a lot of the professional players featured therein have this common idea, even the ones who do play Night Elf, that it's like there's like a joke where it's like no hack, just any. It's like the idea is that Night Elf is so easy that you don't actually have to play it. It's like not on a fair playing ground with everybody else. But it's sort of like, it's just like a low micro race, I think, or it's like some element of it is like a lot easier to play at a high level. Whereas,
well, once you hit a certain point, you just push a button and this guy's unit is disabled forever. It's like locked down for everything.
Yeah, and they also have those moon wells, so good luck trying to like siege against them in that respect, right? So
yeah, it's kind of funny. Like, I don't think, like, when I think of like Brood War's controls, I don't think of it as mechanics. I think of it as discipline, because I think when it comes down to how you interact with it, it really does just come down more to discipline. A mechanic would be something like it's mechanics in the sense of There's a good way to describe it. It was a way of describing it for League of Legends. Mechanics is how you know how the unit works, but I actually have come to think of that more of discipline. You're so experienced that you're super disciplined. You know how to predict how certain things are going to behave, so you know how far your projectiles are going to go with your skill shots. Because I always play with smart cast and no indicators of any kind.
Right. Yeah.
I never ever used any of that stuff because I want speed. Because I map everything in my head what's going to happen, so I get discipline. With StarCraft, it's the same way. It's like you have the confidence to attack all these lurkers with your Marines because you know you can dodge their projectiles. That's discipline. That can be seen as mechanics, but a game mechanic would be more like the interaction of lockdown with, mechanical units, in the sense that this ability interacts in this way with that. That's how it mechanically functions. So there's like kind of like a gray area for definitions in that regard, but at least that's how I see it. And Brood War scales insanely well with the discipline, where when you get really, really, really good, there are still ways you can continue to get really, really, really good by being more disciplined, by being able to fine-tune your control that much more. That's where the pathing thing comes in. With games like StarCraft 2 and stuff, the cap for your discipline is very low, where you can actually just outplay somebody much higher level than you with way more experience than you just because of really, really stupid things like immortals and roaches, where you usually enter the portion where no matter what you do, how well you play, you can't actually really do anything about it at all.
Yeah.
Whereas in Brood War, you can reach insane levels off of mechanical, aka disciplined play, off of micro and stuff like that. While at the same time, if you're actually good, you can be using those opportunities to take advantage of your macro play as well. And you just don't really see that in other games. Not to that extent, anyways.
Well, I think that the way that it works with Brood War is like you learn how your units interact with one another, and then you sort of like have a clear-cut way to approach interactions in a very different way. Like, a layman isn't going to know how to avoid lurker spines with Marines that are stim-packed or whatever. And you can say, like, well, Marines have stim-pack, and when they're stim, they move faster, and that's a mechanic. But, like, knowing exactly how fast is definitely more related to discipline, I would say.
Yeah, knowing when to actually stop an attack.
Yeah.
And having the confidence to stop an attack before something actually resolves.
Knowing the range of the lurker attack before it, expires and no longer deals damage, or, all that other stuff. I guess that would be more like the mechanical elements of, like, the lurker's attack deals damage on these frames of its animation, whereas, like, you compare that to actually knowing when to interact with that game mechanic is more about discipline.
Yeah. So, like Final Fantasy XIV, like I said, you'll take damage from indicators that vanish long after you remove them. Well, the inverse is true too. You can actually move out and back into them and be in them and not actually get hit by them. So when you're disciplined enough to know the latency, you basically are playing like a different game that you don't actually see. But you understand the ins and outs of how it functions, so you can still play that way. Server side, you're doing everything correctly, but on your side, you're actually moving into a threat and taking no damage from it. So there's actually quite a bit of that kind of stuff within online games especially, but within any of these games where you're really getting to the point where you're so disciplined, you understand the game to the point you don't actually really need to be paying attention to what's going on at all. That's actually how you're supposed to be playing a shmup, is you're supposed to be watching the entire screen, not focusing on any single thing at once. If you get really focused on something at once, that's how you die, because everything on the screen is relevant to what's going on. So you need to be disciplined enough and confident enough to be able to handle your movement and stuff without focusing on just yourself and what's immediately around you. You need to be seeing what's going on as a whole and have that discipline to be able to grasp the entire image and process the entire image at once.
Yeah, the other key distinction I'll make between StarCraft and other RTSs, or at the very least StarCraft and its sequel, is that for me, competitively playing StarCraft is about making less mistakes than your opponent, whereas I've always said that StarCraft 2 feels a lot more like executing a pre-built strategy perfectly. And the closer you are to perfection, which the fact that it's achievable at all is like a really big red flag for me, is the closer you are to being like the top end of the player base. Whereas Brood War, you'll never play perfectly because there's always mistakes you're going to make. You just have to make less mistakes, less grievous ones than your opponent, and that's sort of how you snowball to a victory.
Yeah, I had perfected certain builds in StarCraft that propelled me to High Diamond when High Diamond was still the top. And I definitely wouldn't say I was actually like legit super good at the game, but because I knew to build this at that time and this at this time, all I had to do was just copy paste that, and I always came out on top.
Right.
So it was actually a very unfulfilling experience. Whereas in StarCraft 1, I struggled to become any decent. I play against Mucky constantly, and I only won one game off of him legitimately, and it wasn't even legitimately because he decided not to build tanks against me as Protoss. So I barely managed to win against him in that like limp thing. So obviously I was making tons of mistakes. So there's so many ways you can improve and see tangible results off of that, like just keeping your money low, properly saturating your mineral fields, knowing when to build extra hatcheries or factories and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of it that I would say is pretty important to know, and that's where the discipline comes in, is like knowing those things. But I also think that it's a little weird that in something like StarCraft 2, I think that what you described with the weaker overall player being able to win through like basically just abusing a certain mechanic or build order or whatever of the game, that's like stifling skill expression of a more skilled player, because then that player can't express their skill. But I think something that trips a lot of people up with this line of logic is that they'll just say, well, playing StarCraft 2 that way is like a skill. So like abusing the game's mechanics or whatever is the skill that you need to express, more so than what you would have to do with Brood War, where you have to like express your micro and macro efficiency. And my counter to that generally has been that you're not really playing an RTS. You're not expressing the skills necessary to be successful at an RTS. But I don't know if we can really go deeper than that when sort of dissecting that criticism.
Well, I certainly think there's some legitimacy in saying that for StarCraft 2 and saying that if you won, you won, and that was an expression of skill. But the thing about StarCraft 2 is it requires so little skill to play with, to begin with, that it just didn't really feel very rewarding to me in most of those cases. It always did feel rewarding for me to abuse Ravens, but more because Ravens were so utterly fucking broken. It was a way of this, I could literally remove the game from you and remove your ability to interact with me whatsoever. But that's in the same case of CC and other such toxic stuff within stuff like League of Legends. It's always empowering to be on the beginning or giving side of that rather than on the receiving side. And this means that the results is always going to result in a very binary response, whether you're going to be enjoying just completely removing the ability for someone to do anything, or you're going to be on the receiving side of that and you're going to feel like absolute shit. Whereas I think in large case in Brood War, most defeats can be an educational experience. And a lot of people probably won't see it that way. I know most people get really salty when they lose. But like even in D&D, when I die in games, I always look at it as like an educational experience. What decisions could I make to prevent this from happening? Even though that is in large part decided by RNG. But in StarCraft 2 and other titles like that with the utility creep, it is very often a case of you just getting screwed by something that's really badly designed. And that's definitely the case in League of Legends, where you can very, very easily just enter situations where no matter how well you play, there is actually nothing you can do. So long as the opponent pushes this button, which they have really no reason not to push, that's just it. Like, you just can't do anything. It gets to the point where you can't even like actually approach the equation to try to solve it. And those are situations that always should be avoided in any game, in any genre.
Well, I think that anything that you're doing that's going to, like when you're adding a mechanic like they did in StarCraft 2, where they added these macro mechanics because they changed enough about the user interface that they felt you weren't really looking at your base enough, whatever drove them to that assumption, that seems to be a reasonable enough, like, reverse engineered assumption on our part that would be why that they chose to add in the macro mechanics. But like you said earlier, they don't actually add anything but chores. So it's not really expressing skill. I'm pretty sure they said something to that extent.
That was the reason they added it when they added it in beta or whatever it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were there from the beta, but I could be wrong about that. It's been so long since I tested the beta or whatever, but all I know is that pressing this button on cooldown is not really a skill that's in line with the rest of an RTS.
Yep.
And I guess depending on what you actually define as an RTS's core skill set could vary between RTS titles, but when comparing to the game that you are making a sequel to, when it's a direct downgrade in terms of the actual amount, like, interaction you have with the game and with its mechanics, that's a big problem from my perspective, because it's not just that it's depriving players of the ability to express their own skill. It's also that, like, well, not only that their own skill from StarCraft 1 carrying over to StarCraft 2, but it's also that, like, you know, the skill that they are required to become disciplined in is actually not engaging in any way, because they're not really engaging with the game world around them. It's just they push this button and now they don't fall behind. It contributes to the whole idea that instead of making mistakes, you're executing perfectly. And, you know, that's a whole other conversation, I suppose.
Yeah, it's like the excuse, or the conundrum. How much value do you put in just raw execution? Well, in a competitive environment, I think the execution should be something driven by competition. But yeah, that's not really what happens. It basically amounts to a parallel masturbation between you and the player, as opposed to you trying to overcome the player. There is a difference. It's hard to put into words, but there is a difference.
Well, honestly, when I play StarCraft 2, I don't even feel like I'm playing against the other player most of the time. It feels more so that I'm playing against a whole host of mechanics and design philosophies that are designed to really funnel my decision-making down a certain path that the developer intended. You know, they build X, you build Y. You know, it's just... You've used the words Simon Says to describe things like, you know, very lateral decision-making enforced by developers in the past, like QuickTime events and whatever. That's basically what StarCraft 2's multiplayer feels like a lot of the time. It's just like a real-time, sort of more fast-paced Simon Says game.
Yep.
And, I don't know. Does Simon say anything else, or is that enough to wrap things up for this particular episode?
I think that's pretty good for now. I'm kind of tired, so...
Well, there you go. I think that this is something we can talk about for a lot longer, and I'm sure that we'll revisit it in future episodes, because there's a lot to discuss with, like, not just the historical account, but just how RTSs have fallen out of, like, the public eye, in terms of why they're basically never worked on anymore. You'll get like 2 or 3 a year, and most of them will just have like these weird RPG mechanics or something. So it'll be interesting to further explore what makes Brood War stand out amongst everything else that has been released in the overall, just in the overall field of the genre, I suppose. But thank you for joining me for this podcast, and thank you, viewers. I will see you guys next time. We both will. And yeah, until then, Necron, you fuck. Don't fall asleep on us next time, and have a happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Necron!